regenerative civilization, our worldview looks very, very different than it does now. It's less about individualism and less about separation, and a lot more about interconnectedness with each other, with the non-human world, with the planetary ecosystem.
Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to the Light Forest Podcast, a journey of exploration to bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. In Season 0, we explore philosophies, technology, spirituality, and more. Anything that can help us get to the root of our global problems and move away from dark forest systems of extraction and fear. If you're listening to this right now, welcome to the first episode of Season 0 of the podcast, and thank you so much for joining. In this episode, I speak to Andrea Farias, a researcher, designer, and founder of a project called Diome. Opening the website of Diome, you will be struck by the first paragraph that you land on. Open quotes. We're standing at a crossroads in history. The planetary systems that sustain us are collapsing, exemplified by the climate emergency and growing global unrest. In front of us, there is a choice. Continue on the road to self-destruction, or redefine the role of humanity within nature. End quotes. Andrea's work is dedicated to what she considers to be the most important task of our time, birthing a regenerative civilization, and that digital technologies are key to this transition. Andrea and I got to know each other as Kernel Fellows earlier this year, and in my own Light Forest exploration, I have learned much from her work with Diome. So I'm super excited to be able to bring this conversation to you. In this conversation, Andrea lays out her vision of what a regenerative civilization might look like. And she explains this through the lens of a framework, cultural materialism, which I think is really useful towards understanding change at different levels, from system level, the infrastructure level, and then the level of humans, which is our minds, ideas, values, and belief systems, which for me as part of Light Forest is a really important way to understand change. And it's really interesting to hear how Andrea explains this framework. She also unpacks the idea and the concept of regeneration, particularly in the context of economics. We look at the role that technology can play in assisting us. And here, Andrea, while she definitely puts in digital technologies as a key role in helping us transition towards a regenerative civilization, she also lays out some caution and red flags to pay attention to. We get to talk about institutions, and in particularly why we need new types of institutions to steward us, and the limitations or even drawbacks of the systems and institutions that we have today. Listen to the conversation. You'll see that Andrea speaks articulately with rich examples, data, frameworks, and it's really insightful to hear everything she says. And she also shares really authentically about her own life and her own experience, which led her to question many of the assumptions that she had about the world and about how to live life. She used to be a researcher and designer within the corporate innovation space. She's worked with clients such as Change.org and Mozilla and founded her own company. Yet, things happened in her life that led her to change course, and going through this, she found a more authentic, a more joyful way to live life and move her attention towards the topics and themes that she talks about now through Diome and in this conversation with us on the podcast. So I really recommend listening to this conversation in full. In many ways, this is a great pilot episode for the entire season, because a lot of the themes that she unpacks, a lot of the questions that we delve into are ones that I think we'll continue probing over the course of the season. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and without further ado, let's move right there. So welcome, Andrea, to the Light Forest podcast.
So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I'd like to invite you to paint a picture for us of your light forest world, a world that resonates with your vision of technology assisting us to transition to a regenerative civilization? What would such a world look like?
Yeah, I'd love to paint a picture. In fact, this is something that is at the core of my work, is trying to bring together different ideas from different areas and emerging technologies to spirituality to economic and political systems to actually understand what does a regenerative civilization even look like. I mean, I think that's something that we're still very much discovering, and I'm still very much discovering. But I think it really, the way that I think about it is in three parts, kind of informed by the idea of cultural materialism, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it basically says that it basically talks about kind of different layers of society and how they affect each other. So the superstructure, our worldviews and values, and how we see the world essentially. Social structures like our governance systems and the way we make decisions, the way that we educate ourselves and our young people. And finally, the infrastructure. So essentially, technology, tools, and basically, cultural materialism talks about how all these three things affect each other. So when I'm thinking about what does a regenerative civilization look like, I'm thinking about these three layers. And if we start to think about the superstructure, so what are the worldviews? I think that's really kind of the place to start for me, because that talks about how can we see the world differently and how can that inform uh, everything that we bring into the world, right? And so I think in a regenerative civilization, our worldview looks very, very different than it does now. It's less about individualism and less about separation and a lot more about interconnectedness with each other, with the non-human world, with the planetary ecosystem. It talks about how each of us, we're more than just how we think of ourselves. We're more than kind of the identities that we give ourselves. Each person is a planet in themselves, right? I'm made up of lots of different cells and tissues, and I am an interconnected planet full of different kinds of beings. And really, kind of what I call Andrea is just an emergent property of all those beings that make up me. So I think these kinds of ways of thinking are gaining a lot more traction now, and I think this is what's going to really take us forward into a regenerative civilization, is these values of interconnectedness, of emergence, of distributed systems, or of being part of the greater whole. So it's no longer just about being me, Andrea, or having a national identity, but actually feeling like part of a planetary identity and feeling a sense of interconnectedness. And that really what I call me is just something that emerges from the relationships of all the cells in my body and of this body with all the other bodies around me, and with the social institutions that we have, and with the physical world itself. So I think regenerative civilization, these are the ideas that are emerging, or that are, if we're talking about regenerative civilization, these are the ideas that are grounded in that civilization. These are kind of the ideas that we take for granted in our everyday. And so if we accept these new kinds of belief systems and these kinds of worldviews, then that creates a very different structure for our social systems and our technology, our infrastructure itself. And so I think there's this idea of, so at the same time, there's this kind of global planetary identity, but at the same time, there's also a sense of pluralism. So when I think about this, I think about the this quote by the Zapatistas that's becoming very famous now, of a world where many worlds fit. And I think of that bigger world as this planetary identity, and the many worlds within it as pluralism, as the different values that are held by different societies. I would imagine in a regenerative civilization, there's lots of different ways of living, lots of different values, lots of different ways of understanding what is a good way to live. And so if we ground that a little bit more in experience, I think in every place in the world that would look a little bit different. I'm originally from Venezuela, but I live in London in the UK for many years. So when I think about a regenerative future, these are the two places that I'm often thinking about in terms of what might this world look like, how might it present itself in different ways. And so if you think of a place like London, right now is one of the financial capitals of the world, but there's also this emergent a lot of emergent movements around solidarity and around community and about being with each other. And so I imagine a future London, and where we're part of a regenerative civilization, it's less about the extraction of financial capital and more about the solidarity and these emergent communities, about taking care of each other, and rather than a health system that treats us when we're sick, you might have within London a neighborhood or social structures around you in which people are making sure that you have your needs met, that you have food. You're sharing in the responsibility of the basic needs of life, of everyone being fed, of ensuring that you have positive mental health experiences, in that you're becoming more of yourself. These kind of educational systems where it's not just about going through a process where you're trying to get a degree or you're trying to get a diploma, but where you have a community of learning around you, where you're working continuously to explore your interests and become more of yourself and provide value for the communities around you. And so I see these kinds of social structures, new social structures emerging in cities. In the UK, there's this amazing concept called radical care, which is emerging, which is talking about similar things, about how we don't necessarily need to institutionalize every form of care, that we need to create these neighborhood networks or family networks in order to provide every person for their needs. There's also a big movement around community technology, and how do communities create the technology that they need themselves, rather than relying on the tech giants to actually provide for that. So in a regenerative civilization, in a place like London, I would imagine this community energy is very strong. People are working together to create the things they need, whether that be technology, whether that would be better health outcomes. So that's how I imagine kind of the priorities of a place like London shifting. And when I think about somewhere like Venezuela, I actually, just about a year ago, I went back to Venezuela to see my family after many years. And one place I went to was this beautiful place in the Amazon in Venezuela, where Angel Falls is one of the tallest waterfalls in the world. This is a place, Venezuelan people called Canaima, but the local indigenous population call it Querepacupay. And this is one of the most beautiful places on earth. And what really struck me is that the over-reliance of the indigenous people on the tourist coming there and giving their money in order for them to be able to survive. And without the tourism, they're really reliant on mining mining gold or other precious metals and actually destroying the place that they live, even though they really don't want to do that, but they don't really have much other choice because of the structures of the world that we live in. And so in a regenerative civilization, I would imagine that we, as a global society, as a planetary society, we see this value that these indigenous communities are providing in maintaining what are essentially the lungs of the earth. And we have some way for providing for these communities for doing that job that isn't just relying on tourism or isn't relying on them essentially wrecking their home in order to extract. And I also see that there's so much value in the ancient knowledge of these communities, in how they understand the land and in the land itself. You know, the Amazon is one of the places where you have the most different types of medicinal plants, for example. And so how can we actually take advantage of that in a regenerative way and essentially make space for indigenous communities that have all this knowledge to be able to share it with the world in a way that's actually benefiting all of us and is not destroying the lungs of the planet, which we actually need in order to breathe. So these are just some of the ways that I'm thinking about what a regenerative civilization would look like.
Wow, that was a really beautiful vision. And I mean, I'm picturing a London where people are, as you say, centered around social capital in that sense, and community and connection. And I like how you brought up the really important connection to belief systems that we hold, and that's in this process of regeneration that we talk about really starts from within and seep out into the world around us. And I'm seeing this wonderful interplay of then of like systems and individuals, right? Where you're saying systems are allowing and creating breathing room for each being, each person to sort of follow their own path. Hearing about technology that is, yeah, community built, community governed, and we'll definitely get to that because I want to sort of learn more about like some of the initiatives that might be happening right now, transitioning towards that space, and diving into the regeneration process that you talked about. This word is used a lot, and often I'm quite drawn to it. You know, when I hear the word regeneration, something in me feels good, feels like it's including what we have today, but it's talking about an evolution. That's the sort of feeling I get of something different from we have today. And you know, often we hear the word sustainability a lot, and you know that sort of maybe tends to be the sort of dominant narrative. Yeah, I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I had to sum up regeneration in one sentence, I would say it was humans acting as nature. So right now there's this kind of imagined separation of humans from nature, and this idea that humans somehow can conquer nature or be the masters of nature, when really we are part of nature. Even our technologies are part of nature. And as long as we are not able to accept that and see it that way, then what we're doing is essentially draining or extracting the natural capital and the social capital that we need to survive. And so if we think of capital in a broader sense, capital is essentially, resources, as I said, that we need to live. And so financial capital is something that essentially is trying to be an abstract representation of these resources, but in a way is very disconnected from that. And so the more that we try and generate abstract profit, the more we're actually extracting our natural capital and our social capital, which are really the things that we rely on. Natural capital in order to feed us, make the things that we actually need to survive, water, air. And the social capital, essentially the interconnected social structures that ensure that our needs are met, and that, whether that be our physical needs or our more kind of emotional, psychological needs.
So what I'm almost hearing is a regeneration as also almost flashing a light onto this previously or for a long time ignored input into our economy, natural resources, and even social capital, as you say, two sort of aspects that are not really considered when we think about growth, or when we think about measuring where we are as a civilization or as a society.
Right, absolutely. Our economies right now tend to be sort of support abstraction, and accumulation. So essentially, abstraction is when we see something without value as more like money as more valuable than a real tangible resource like food, which I need to survive. But with money I can, buy anything I want. So that's kind of, so this level of abstraction makes it more valuable because it becomes something, a representation of power, so acquisition power essentially. Whereas with an apple, for example, I can only eat it. I can't do anything else. So that's seen as less valuable, right? But this has gone so far to the point where we actually are more interested in creating the abstract stuff, the financial capital, rather than the stuff that we actually need to live, like the apple, because we're viewing it as more valuable. Whereas this is just an illusion at the end of the day, because the financial capital exists to help us create more of the things that we need to live, not to destroy the things that we need to live, right? So this leads more extraction of our natural resources in order to abstract them into financial capital, rather than actually recognizing the intrinsic value of these things, of natural capital, like trees, like water, like the nutrients in our soil. So essentially, we need to go the opposite way. We need to revalue these natural assets and the social capital that actually helps us essentially function as a human society, rather than just this abstract stuff, which is really just a representation. It's just there to kind of help the economy flow. It's not really, if we see it as the be and an end all, then we're going to be actually losing the stuff that we really need to survive, which is what's happening now.
Yeah, I like that you talk about revaluing. This is something that actually, so just this a few days ago, I'm here in Thailand and I'd gone to visit a friend's farm, and walking around, seeing them trying to regenerate the soil, sort of bring more life back, organisms, fungi, grow compost, and then seeing how this what at that moment I saw as really vital to like our survival, yet seeing how undervalued a lot of that is, like the sort of economic labor that goes into it, the sort of expertise that goes into it. Ultimately, it's being sold for prices that are, it's almost not sustainable enough to grow a business around it today. And people struggling, or farmers struggling, or people struggling to grow. And that sort of made me feel that here I am, and this core vital value that I need to survive isn't really valued enough for people to actually go and do it and grow it and build it. And I think that also ties in nicely to your example of this over financialization, where it's like it's almost now where it's, rather than maybe grow the healthiest food, it's grow as much food as we can with money, and where then even food itself and the quality of food and the nutrients and what it means to us is abstracted to where it's just something that's just quantified in terms of number of apples rather than the actual nutrients and the sort of healthy of that apple extraction or the abstraction of value.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I think about it is, and this goes back to the idea of regeneration, is that indigenous societies, and when I say indigenous societies, I mean cultures that live in harmony with their ecosystems. When you have a culture that lives in harmony with their ecosystem, what's essentially happening is that their technologies, so the way that they act on the world, are continuously regenerating natural capital. So just to give you an example, if I cut down a tree, I might cut down a tree on one side, but I have, let's say, this cultural tradition that as I cut down the trees, I also have to help seed more trees, or do some kind of opposite activity, which is actually helping, the forest grow, even as I cut down the trees. And at the same time as technology is continuously building natural capital, social systems are continuously building social capital, right? So that means that as we're acting on the world and acting with each other, we're ensuring that we're building up in our people, in our society, that we're ensuring that people have their needs met, so that everyone within the society is actually has the capacity to then give back to the society itself. So it becomes this cycle of, as we engage with nature, we're actually continuously improving the conditions for life to flourish in our ecosystem. And as we're acting with each other, we're continuously improving our social and the physical health of our people, and the mental health of our people, and their cultural knowledge, and whatever it is. And so as the more we act, the more we build up the health of our ecosystem in our society. And what we're doing is exactly the opposite. As we're acting on the world and on each other, we're actually depleting that capital. So we're making our ecosystems less able to sustain themselves, and we're making our people and our social institutions less able to sustain themselves. And so if we continue this process of extraction and depleting this capital, then it just becomes really risky, because you're risking the collapse of your ecosystem and the collapse of your social systems. And that's the place where we're at. So we need to reverse this trend and figure out how to do this continuous replenishing of the social and natural capital.
Yeah, I think hearing you say that, begs the question of like how or where or why does that transition start to happen, right? Like, is it how do we as people start to shift our sense of value, where we start to sort of see and feel and realize that what we valued in the past or what we even valued today perhaps isn't giving us nourishment, social value that we care about. Like, yeah, how do you see that shift taking place? And I think that seems to be like the difficult point of when we shift from illusion to disillusion, almost, of like moving away from present paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it needs to happen, well, going back to these different layers of society that I was talking about: superstructure, which is the worldview; the social structure, which are the institutions and governance systems; and then the infrastructure, which is the technology. We can't just focus on one of these areas. All of these three areas influence each other, and we see that these three layers co-evolve with each other throughout history in different civilizations. And so really we need to be thinking about all three at the same time. And so, like you're saying, more and more people are becoming disillusioned, and we're changing our worldviews. We're rediscovering different kinds of value and different kinds of worldviews. And that's incredible. But beyond just this kind of individual soul searching, I think we need to develop more institutions and essentially paths for people to follow. As people are understanding that this isn't necessarily the way to live, we need to be actually creating systems to allow to support people in identifying new value systems, supporting people in learning more about these new values that are emerging. And so I think that is part of it, is how do we support people in changing their values and changing their worldviews. But then there's also the two other layers, right? So this, on the social structure side, how do we adapt our governance systems to actually be up to the task of governing in a time where information is everywhere, you know? when we can communicate essentially almost at the speed of light, how do you develop new governance systems for this? How do you distribute power in order for people to actually make the decisions that they need to, like in the place where they are, and it's on not just all centralized? How do you acknowledge that every single person is essentially a node in our collective brain, right? So actually harness the collective intelligence of humanity in order to govern our social systems. If we're harnessing the collective intelligence of humanity, why not even beyond that? Why not the collective intelligence of our planet as a whole? So there's a lot that we need to be thinking about. I think on the infrastructure side, we see that a lot of our social systems and a lot of our value systems were essentially developed a long time ago, were developed at a time when essentially the written word was becoming available to more and more people through the printing press and through the development of all these new technologies that allowed the printed word to allowed newspapers to exist, allowed a lot more people to learn to read and write, and so democracy in the way as we know it could function. And that was an incredible development. It's allowed us to have so many of the things that in this world that we take for granted right now. It's allowed at least some of us to have a really excellent quality of life in some respects. But actually, we're in a really different place now in terms of our infrastructure, and in particular in terms of our communication infrastructure. Now we have computers, now we have the internet. And so that opens up the door for completely new kinds of social systems and value systems. So as the internet has become so, a global phenomenon, we've also seen this renewed understanding of trees and forests and how trees connect and talk to each other through mycelia, right? The concept of mycelium is essentially growing as a meme at the same time that the internet has proliferated, right? And it's no coincidence because these new technologies are allowing us to question our value systems, question our worldviews, and also create completely different kinds of governance systems, of social systems that we've never seen before. And really, I think that we haven't fully seen the effects of the digital revolution just yet. I think it's just beginning. And I think it's at the core of how we can support this transition to a regenerative civilization. Because if we explore the affordances of these new systems that we have available, and now even with blockchain and AI, there's a lot of risks, but at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities to understand what new affordances these technologies create to essentially reimagine our social systems and our value systems to be more aligned with a regenerative civilization.
I love mycelium and the tree, the roots example. Because in a way, it's almost like we're building this World Wide Web, right? Hyper-connectedness, computers all connected to each other, and us feeling as part of this hyper-connected whole. Yet at the same time, increasingly feeling like the sort of separate self is still there, right? We still feel as these like separate, disconnected individuals, part of this like wider connected whole. And like seeing technology and seeing this is making us almost like, yeah, question ourselves and sort of better understand who we really are. And what's our own makeup and our own interconnections that we have. I mean, since you mentioned I guess the I've been sort of grappling with is, since you talked about the three layers of the social structure and then, the infrastructure layer. And so today, a lot of, AI and even blockchains coming out of world where we still have the old world paradigm of beliefs and values that, we're trying to change as we talk about trying to regenerate. So we have this AI that's emerging, yet this AI seems to be sort of built on an entire model, entire data set of worldviews, of, perceptions and beliefs that are grounded in this very core that we're trying to shift and we're trying to change, and where the sort of value system that we're trying to change. So how do you see, like, how do we approach this, this challenge where on one hand, AI can be this wonderful, assistant or wonderful player, but also is sort of being formed and being created in a world where, as you say, the ideas of value are completely, wrong, and the ideas of abstraction are completely wrong. Like, how do you see this paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot as well, and I don't know if I even have an answer to this. I think there's, on one side, some people are saying, AI in itself is a fascist technology, just in terms of the way that it's built, because it's essentially, just in its nature as kind of like a predictive technology. It supports stereotyping, and it supports essentially putting people into boxes. And so, yeah, there's a camp that says AI can never be a regenerative technology because of the nature of the technology itself. It's always going to be this kind of oversimplification, over stereotyping. But at the same time, there's it's also a huge opportunity to create knowledge, and to actually begin to even understand this huge amount of data and information that we're creating as a society. No human could ever read the internet. And so, is there a way, if we, for example, were more in control of our data and how AI is being created and what values AI is being embedded with, that it could actually be a tool for regeneration? And I think this is a question that's still very much kind of up in the air. I think there's definitely some amazing uses of AI, but what values is it kind of creating in the people that are using it, in our society as a whole, and is it worth it? Those are questions that I think we're still quite far away from having an answer to, for sure. And I think it's yeah, it's a big problem because we don't have the social systems and the governance systems to even begin to understand this problem and be able to have a real conversation around it. I think as these crazy exponential technologies that have a lot of risks are uh, coming more and more to the forefront and being developed, our democracies and our social systems are deteriorating. And some would say, they were never fit for purpose in the first place, but definitely not fit for purpose now. And so, how are we able to figure out whether AI is something that really meets our needs as a society if we don't have any strong forms to have these conversations? And even if we do have these conversations, then the results might not be heard or heeded by anyone. If you see, for example, in France recently, they had a huge citizens assembly, not on AI, but on climate change. And it was kind of celebrated as a huge move to transform democracy. And after days and days of deliberation on climate change and lots of experts coming in and giving their ideas and their thoughts, and the people within the assembly coming together and actually giving their recommendations, the French government just ignored at least half of their recommendations, and they weren't included in any kind of law. And this seems to be kind of a repeating pattern of, okay, yes, we can talk about things, but we're only going to listen to the things that we like and not the things that we don't like. And obviously, we're not really going to get anywhere with that. And I think part of that is because really we don't have any kind of system for understanding if we should do something apart from money. Can we make money out of it? Yes. Okay, then we'll do it. That's essentially the criteria that we're using to make most decisions as a society now. I mean, having worked in the digital product space, I never worked in AI, but I worked on lots of other software products. And really, what you're trying to do is figure out how can we create value for customers? But at the end of the day, it's about how do we create revenue. It's not about how do we create really the best product. It's about how do we create the best product that creates the most revenue. And sure, some companies might have values and they might say they're sticking by their values, but when push comes to shove, our systems are made in such a way where money has to come first and decisions need to be made for profit. And so I think at the core of that is we need to have decision-making systems that aren't just how do we make the most profit. It's about what we said before. How do we build our natural and social capital over time? How do we create systems which are increasing our planet's capability to support life, including ourselves? And we don't have anything close to that. And I think that's why we really need to be, as we're creating these new kinds of technologies, at the same time or even faster than we create them, we need to be thinking about how do we change the way that we talk about things, make decisions. How do we change this, or how do we create new ways to make ethical choices about the things that we're doing as a society? How do we add a layer of should we do this to everything that we do, not just what's going to make the most money? So yeah, that's very much part of the process.
Yeah, it's such a paradox, isn't it? It's like on one hand, very institutions, as you say, the French government here was held this, referendum. The very institutions that we hope or trust will steward us through climate change or steward us through, regulating or managing AI are the very institutions that may be benefiting from the status quo. And so on one have this paradox where we're dealing with where it's like we want to create the change, but the only change that's allowed to happen is that allows existing systems to continue with business as usual, just a small negotiated amount of change being allowed. I mean, I know that for me, working in the tech policy space and seeing, having a front view to the sort of train crash of the web over the last 10 years, where, as you say, ultimately the decisions that drive the tech companies are, profit motives, and the shareholders are the ones that founders and the company's standard. And so we're sort of stuck in this paradox of needing to shift values, yet the very institutions and systems that are almost have that monopoly in who sets the values of our society and who sets the values of our time are the ones that maybe need to move out of the way, need some sort of change there. And I wonder here, I mean, you touched on indigenous communities earlier on in the call. And I wonder here whether this is a space where we can come in, imagine or create a space where, we do have at this indigenous community level, perhaps, a system or value systems or institutions, even on a micro scale, that perhaps are functioning on a different value system or functioning on this paradigm. And is this maybe a way where we create like new institutions that are thinking about stewardship of the planet and the planet's resources, or thinking of stewardship of AI, where we can maybe, like either like directly learn from institutions or systems that exist at this indigenous community level, or even have ways where we bring these communities and have their role in how we take decisions, and how we talk about value, because it feels like that's clearly missing from our sort of mainstream power decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both things are badly needed. We need to learn from indigenous values and indigenous institutions, and very much incorporate indigenous voices into our own institutions. And at the same time, I think there's also we need to consider that also indigenous communities don't have all the answers, because at the end of the day, this is a very, very different world to what indigenous communities, the kinds of worlds that indigenous communities exist in. And so, of course, we can learn a lot from indigenous communities about stewardship of the earth, about social institutions. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge that this is, we've never faced these problems before. And so we need to be all learning together to, both kind of the industrial civilization that we're both living in, indigenous communities, and every different kind of worldview and culture that we have available. Like I said previously, if we think of every single person on the planet as just like a node in a global brain, we need our whole brain to be working fully at full capacity in order to make this transition, in order to reimagine our institutions, in order to reimagine how we create our technologies. And so it's not about replicating anything that exists in the world today. It is about learning from communities who are living in harmony with the earth. But at the same time, we need to understand, how do we apply those principles and those values in this world where we're creating exponential technology, and where we have populations that are living lives right now that are very different, that are not really aligned with living in harmony with the earth. And how do you make that transition for all these kinds of peoples, which are living very different kinds of lives at the moment? So we need to bring everyone into the future.
And since with Diome, you're working on this question of how does information technology play this role, right, in this transition? And you touched upon earlier about how there are communities who believe that, AI is not regenerative technology, and that the, technology itself is extractive, either in terms of natural resources or in other ways. So do you see technology then playing a role perhaps in creating the infrastructure for these kinds of new institutions, which will maybe allow a change in sort of collective behavioral change in shifting values? Like, do you see maybe technology coming into that layer where it becomes the infrastructure layer? And perhaps here, like, when we look at Web3 and in the blockchain space, I know, there's a lot of conversation around infrastructure layer and, moving, towards creating, like alternative institutions. How do you see that? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, this is something definitely I'm thinking a lot about, and it's something that I still don't know if I've come to a full conclusion. But I think, really, first of all, I think technology has to be part of the solution because it's part of the problem. We can't really move forward without technology. I mean, as part of this project, one of the things that I was looking at is, how do we even define technology? What is technology? And at the end of the day, if we try and break it down, it's really any kind of way that we manipulate materials, energy, or information to actually act on the world and meet our needs. So you can't really separate technology from the human experience. Like, the real question is, what technology? Is it books? Is it blockchain? Is it spears? Is it, bricks? Like, which kinds of technologies are we using? And so I think, really, at the end of the day, it's not about, we have to use some sort of technology because that is the way that we're able to survive in this world. That is our niche. And so when we think about technology now, we usually think about more digital technologies, but it's really any way that we act on the world. And I think the second thing is that, particularly digital technologies, they're not just ways that we act on the world, but ways that we act on ourselves. So, we see it very clearly now with things like TikTok, Instagram. There's these huge conversations around, how are we affecting teenagers' brains? How are we affecting our own brain? Because, at the end of the day, humans are creatures that are able to be programmed. That's why we're born basically not being able to do anything, because we need to be programmed in order to actually function. So how are we programming ourselves to function within this world? And at the moment, kind of one of the answers to that is, well, social media that essentially designed to extract profit. So yeah, I think technology is how we act on the world, and it's how we act on ourselves. And so we need to harness technology in order to create the kind of world that we want to create and create the kind of selves that we want to create. So that's one thing. So what does this technology look like? Is it blockchain? Is it AI? I don't really know. I think what we need to do is, well, we have these technologies. How can we harness what we have, whether it's blockchain, whether it's AI, whether it's more low-tech technologies, to actually run different kinds of experiments and see, well, how can we create different kinds of social systems? How can we create different kinds of value structures? And I think this is very much happening. This is happening, in Taiwan, for example. They're doing amazing work, Audrey Tang in Taiwan, in incorporating these frontier technologies into their democracy there, and actually being able to understand the values of the people in the country in a way that isn't just voting every 4 years. That's something really interesting that's happening. How do we build civic infrastructure that's distributed, is distributing power? And I think they're thinking really clearly about that. And for example, another really great project that I love is grassroots economics. Will Ruddick in Kenya doing, and all over the world really, but primarily in Kenya, doing some amazing work with harnessing blockchain, create community currencies that actually reflect indigenous social systems. So I think there's some really interesting work, some really interesting experiments. And I think it's not even about the technology itself, is, what can we harness in order to actually experiment with new ways of living and working and communicating with each other. And I think, new technologies give us huge opportunities to do this, but it's not just about the most cutting edge technology. It's really about where can we find different opportunities and affordances in order to create experiments that show us new ways of living.
Yeah, I think Taiwan for me is definitely one of my favorite examples to think of tech interactions that are happening there. And I think being from Asia, whenever I'm often asked to speak about, the state of the web in Asia, it's usually fairly dystopian, not very nice examples. But Taiwan tends to be the one area where you can pick some more interesting and novel examples. And yeah, I definitely feel you on the point about technology both being the problem and part of the solution. I mean, I think sometimes listening to groups who might take a very maybe radical stance against technology, I empathize with that position. Sometimes I feel like we're sort of denying what is. Like we are living in the world today, and this technology is here. It's at our fingertips. And so, denying it or pushing it away won't actually, help us make this transition. And how do we use it as empower ourselves, take the sort of perspectives that we want, and then build technology to it. There's a wonderful framework that I've been inspired by, which employs Taoist framework, where it's talking about technology being guided by the Tao. It's by a scholar Yu Kuei, and he talks about what is the purpose of technology? What are we ultimately optimizing it for? And if the old world way was optimizing it for extraction and shaping the world, as you said, violently to suit our perceived needs, and that's kind of getting us where we are today. It's like, okay, can we shift that? And are there ways where tech can help us sort of be in more harmony with each other and more harmony with nature, as being like a noble way of using tech for that cause. And in a way, this podcast as well, right, is facilitated by a whole stack of technologies and allowing us to, like through your website, and through the podcast and all the wonderful projects that we have to sort of share and spread that information at such a quick speed. You've talked about programming, and we've talked a lot about, I think, already in this podcast on this transition of values, right? Seeing value shift and seeing, that perception of what value is and changing that. At the beginning of the episode, I read out your bio, and you yourself, have this transition where you were in the technology space, you were building products and design and UX, and you founded your own company. Yet at some point, your own sort of perception and your own journey and experiences have happened that have perhaps led you to shift value. And I was wondering if you could, yeah, share a little bit more about like your own journey and how you started to feel that maybe the goals or the missions weren't resonating with you, and where you started to see your own regeneration of sorts in terms of how you viewed yourself, how you viewed the world, and that led you on this wonderful journey to where you are now, doing research in this space.
Yeah. Well, it's really twofold, I think. So you mentioned that I founded my own company, and I was actually trying to get that off the ground for many years. It was almost, essentially my life dream to create this company and be a consultant and help people do the product strategy and UX. But one of the things that really, I kept thinking about is that I want to work on projects that create an impact in the world. I want to do good, and doesn't everyone, right? And someone told me when one of the clients I was working for at the time, when I showed them my website that I was building, he said, yeah, but tech for good doesn't really mean anything. Like, what do you mean by that? What is good for you? Like, you need to actually be able to communicate that. What kind of projects are you looking for beyond just tech for good? And this question really stuck with me. And so I actually spent years trying to answer this question, and kind of working for different kinds of clients that I thought would fit within that criteria of what I thought was tech for good, and kind of trying to give it different definitions. Every time I just kept coming up empty. Nothing was good when you scratched under the surface. Even if people had really good intentions, it just came down to what's going to make the most profit at the end of the day. They have investors, they have employees that they need to pay and feed. And a lot of the time they're under some, really strong constraints themselves. So one of the stories that I always tell is kind of one of the moments that really stuck with me was I was working for a healthcare company building an app for their home care service. So essentially mostly for adults that need home care support, or it might be people who are disabled or recovering from surgery, but mostly the elderly. And what this app was supposed to do was essentially be kind of like a UX interface to support people with their care. And so I was doing research interviews, to find out about people's needs and how do we build this app. And one of the people who responded to my call and booked an interview actually answered the call in the hospital as his father was essentially on his deathbed in the hospital. Wow. And he did this because, he was really desperate to talk to someone about the situation that he had faced trying to manage the care for his father. And he was telling me about how, poor the care was. Nurses would show up that weren't appropriately trained. Often they would be late. Sometimes they wouldn't show up at all, and he wouldn't know, there would be no one taking care of his father. And just all these stories, kind of, he just needed to get out, communicate to someone, this horrible experience that his father, who was so vulnerable, had received from this company. And the company itself, was struggling. They needed to provide this care on such a tight budget, so much competition. they couldn't pay their nurses who are providing this essential care more than essentially minimum wage. Throughout this call, just my heart sank because I was like, there's no way that any app I can build is going to solve this problem. I can build the best home care app in the world, but that's not going to improve the experience of someone whose nurse shows up and is not trained to do the job or doesn't want to be there, isn't getting paid what they deserve. How can I even solve that problem? And this was kind of like the culmination of years of kind of asking myself this question of, this isn't the real problem, but, I'm paid to look over here and create this and not actually look over there where the real problem is. And so that was a super impactful experience for me because, this like very kind man was taking the time out to be with his father on his deathbed just to be able to tell me this story. And he didn't even expect me to like change anything, or he didn't want to complain. He just wanted to share his story so I would understand. Wow, that hit me so hard. And that was just I think weeks or before I actually decided to shut down my company and kind of look for a new path. Try and understand like what is good. How can I do something that is actually solving the problem and not just kind of like building an interface to kind of plaster over it. And the other thing was that I suffered essentially a back injury through what was many years of like bad posture and sitting in the wrong position. So not any kind of accident in particular, but essentially chronic issues with my posture. And during COVID, this became a lot worse until the point where anytime I did a physical activity, I would be essentially in bed for 1 or 2 days because I couldn't move. So there was also, on one side, I was facing kind of this professional question of how do I do good? And on the other side, my body was in complete breakdown. And I had to question pretty much everything about my life because it felt like everything I did was destroying my body. And so I was also at that point, actually, that was already kind of a year or two into this back injury, where I just spent it felt like I was going in circles. My back kept getting better and worse, and I was in pain all the time. And it was just really frustrating because I just didn't know what to do, and I was afraid that I was just going to be in pain for the rest of my life. And so that put me on a journey of reconnecting with my body and reconnecting with my values and actually understanding what's important. And through a lot of reflection, I actually started connecting my own physical problems to what we're doing to the planet. Climate change, biodiversity loss. My body is just a tiny planet. It's also a complex system, and I was essentially not managing very well the health of this complex system in the same way that we're not managing the health of the planetary system. And so that was a real eye-opener for me in terms of just making me completely question my worldview and my values and what I did in the day-to-day and how I treated myself and how I thought about my body. And so those two things together, those two things kind of came together almost at the same time. It was kind of these parallel tracks that eventually just joined, and I realized, wow, this is actually two sides of the same coin. And I think that's really where it all not began necessarily, but when it shifted from something that was maybe going on in the background of my brain to saying, okay, actually, this is the most important thing I can be thinking about right now. I need to like quit everything that I was doing before and find a new way of thinking, of doing things, of living my life. And yeah, that's the journey that brought me here.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think hearing you speak about, coming to terms with your own body and seeing the parables with the world today can be a very difficult recognition to see that. And I think hearing that also maybe makes us also look at our world around us today and, seeing the kinds of, disasters or natural challenges that we're facing as our own signs that, our systems are not working and that, there's a need for some sort of shift or regeneration to take place. And I know here, I mean, at Light Forest, I'm interested in exploring about how the external world is connected to our internal minds and bodies, and seeing that interconnection as so powerful, and sort of learning from the experiences that we had, seeing this as a way to grow and yeah, perhaps better understand ourselves as well. So yeah, I think that's really beautiful that you're able to sort of go through this experience and change your life almost, which I think isn't an easy one to make. I think, you know, people, many people go through health challenges or go through different sort of, experiences, perhaps similar to one, that you might have had, but that seeing and then the actual transition to be able to shift that and to actually then make big shifts in your life. I think that can be very difficult to do, and involves perhaps a lot of loss and pain as well.
Absolutely, but it also involves a lot of joy and discovery. I actually, even though in a way I've lost a lot of things, I think I've gained so much more. I just like before I embarked on this path of regeneration, I felt so scared about the future because I just asked myself, what's going to happen? Like, it seems like the world is breaking down, our social systems are breaking down. It just gave me a lot of anxiety. Or I just had to ignore it completely, either put it all out of my mind or just be full of anxiety. And now, having embarked on this journey, it's not like I'm completely confident that we're going to be able to succeed and actually transition to a more regenerative society. But at least I feel like I'm doing everything I can and I'm having fun along the way. It's not just about the planetary regeneration, it's also about myself, and actually questioning my values and how I live my life has made me focus on the things that I truly value and are important to me. About It's made me focus on learning and understanding the world, and on my relationships with people, and on having amazing discussions and conversations about things that matter to me. And it's changed my life completely because now I just feel like I'm on the right path. Whereas before, looking back, I think I was lost. I didn't know what the future uh, would look like, but I didn't like what I was seeing. And now I just feel confident that, at least I'm doing everything I can to get us to that future. And so, yeah, change comes with pain and loss, but it come with joy and peace as well.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's such a great message. I think I think I feel here listening to you, but also I'm sure people listening as well. It's like both of them come together, and as part of my own Light Forest journey, one of the protocols that I have is about like love, and ultimately like finding inner joy and that interconnection that we have with our planet, and knowing that we can't control everything that's around us, but we can sort of have a better sense and balance internally and within ourselves, and then we can start to spread that and do what we can. So yeah, I think that's really beautiful, and I mean, and I think your journey with your own research around this, as you know, has helped inspire me as well to sort of better understand how to look around, and also to find other humans. You know, as I'm in the space sometimes wondering, like, is there other people out there? Like, what are people doing? What are people saying? And sort of then having meet people and, like, you know, meet you and learn, like, okay, yes, there's other people who care about this. There's other people who are, you know, who are doing work in this space. And yeah, and there's there's a lot that we can do today in this moment to start to sort of make this transition to a regenerative civilization, which I think is a wonderful yeah, ideal to not so much imagine in the future, but today on a day-to-day basis. Like, regeneration starts in every moment and right here. And I think that, like, grounding in that feels like a really powerful note. So thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your own journey and sharing what you've been thinking about and researching with respect to changing our economic systems and moving towards new paradigms. Yeah, look forward to continuing this chat in the future. And thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. This has been amazing. Thank you.
If there's any space that you want people to, you know, find your work or subscribe to, you know, any social media handles, or what's the best place that people can find you?
Yeah, you can all go on my website, Diome, Diome.xyz, or find me on Twitter or Farcaster. But yeah, I recommend going on my website. I have there my social media and also my email in case anyone wants to reach out and chat more about any of these topics.
Lovely. Well, we'll link all of this in the show notes as well. So I'm sure people will be able to find their way to your digital spaces. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much.
Right. And that was the first episode of the Light Forest Podcast Season 0. If you made it all the way here, thank you so much. It means a lot. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Andreas as much as I did. You can check out the show notes for links, and please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app of choice. Share this with your friends, and feel free to leave a rating as well. Any of your help and support means a lot to me personally and will help the Light Forest project grow over time. So, with that, goodbye and see you in the next episode.